Listen closely, because this is the story of a girl named Dominique, a story about belonging not to a place defined by blood or birthright, but to a soul, a landscape, and a time she couldn't remember. She was Parisian, born on the gilded left bank, nestled in a family whose wealth was as old and intricately layered as the limestone of their ancient apartment building. Dominique had everything that money could buy: tutors who spoke 5 languages before she was 10, silks woven in Milan, holidays that spanned continents, and a view of the Eiffel Tower from her bedroom window. But every morning, when the soft Parisian light streamed in, illuminating the polished parquet floors, all she felt was a profound, suffocating alienness. Paris, the city of light, was merely a beautiful, impeccably dressed stranger, and she its unwilling captive. She hated the French language. Its elegant, precise rhythm, which others found musical, sounded to her like the continuous, irritating click of a locked door she could never open. She found the French people, the very individuals who shared her blood and culture, to be insufferable. Their insistence on form, their effortless chic, the way they moved through the world with an air of inherited certainty, only highlighted her own raw, exposed vulnerability. They were reeds swaying gracefully in the Seine's current. She was a jagged stone dragged from a foreign shore, constantly scraping against the riverbed. She couldn't maintain relationships. Friendships dissolved into polite, distant exchanges, and romance was a non-starter. Men found her striking, her dark hair, eyes the color of heather, and the restless energy she carried, but they quickly found her unsettling. Her detachment was too severe, her gaze too often focused on something they couldn't see, and her silences were too deep. The truth was, Dominique was drowning in sensory overload and internal dissonance. This profound alienness translated into a relentless, low-grade terror. Every social interaction was a meticulously choreographed performance, exhausting her mind and spirit. She wasn't just detached, she was battling a crushing physical anxiety that manifested in a constant breathless tightness in her chest. She often believed she couldn't draw a full, satisfying breath in all of Paris. Sleep offered no true escape, only a thin boundary between her waking misery and the fleeting, terrifying vividness of her moorland visions. The emotional consequence of this displacement was the constant, insidious conviction that she was deeply, fundamentally flawed. A spoiled child who, despite possessing all the world's supposed keys to happiness, refused to turn them. This self-loathing became another gilded chain, heavier than any family expectation. She felt an unbearable guilt for her suffering, knowing her life was the envy of thousands, yet inside, she felt like a screaming infant trapped beneath layers of cold marble. Her inability to connect with her peers wasn't arrogance, it was a preemptive retreat, a defense against exposing the raw, churning wilderness inside her that felt so utterly incompatible with Parisian sophistication. Her worst affliction, the one that truly sealed her reputation as the folle of the family, was the visions. They weren't like dreams. They were sudden, brutal shifts in reality. She could be sitting at a society dinner, listening to the drone of conversation, when the polished crystal would warp. The delicate scent of truffles would vanish, and she would find herself utterly elsewhere. The visions were always the same, a relentless, sweeping expanse of purple and brown moorland, the sharp scent of peat smoke and damp earth, the chill bite of wind against bare skin, and the distant, mournful cry of a bird. In these fleeting, agonizing moments, she would see a small, rough-hewn cottage with a smoking chimney, and a man, always the same man, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, laughing. This place, this distant, damp, wild place, was where she belonged. When she tried to describe this life, this sense of home that bled through the edges of her sophisticated Parisian existence, her mother would sigh dramatically, her father would tighten his jaw, and her psychiatrist, a man paid handsomely to keep the family's secret contained, would nod sympathetically and increase her dosage. Her difference wasn't just noted by the family, it was meticulously managed, treated less as an illness and more as a scandalous public relations crisis, an embarrassment, an inconvenient truth. This perception only deepened her isolation, confirming her worst fear, that she truly was crazy, and the only sane thing she could do was disappear. The suffering was atrocious, a dull, constant ache of displacement that sometimes flared into white-hot agony. She was rich, she was beautiful, she was free to do anything, yet she was imprisoned in a life that was genetically, culturally, and financially her own, but spiritually, it was a dungeon. Her difference was not a quirky eccentricity, it was a soul-deep physical rejection of her environment. Every breath in Paris felt like a shallow imitation of a real breath. Then came the annual summer trip, a grand tour dictated by her mother's desire to collect designer pieces and fine art. This year, purely by chance, the itinerary included a week in Scotland, a concession to her father's interest in historic golf courses. The moment the private jet touched down near Edinburgh, something shifted. It wasn't just the air, it was the light, diffused and grey, yet somehow brighter than the Mediterranean sun. It was the rough ancient stone of the architecture, the sheer unbridled green of the landscape that refused to be tamed or manicured. As the hired car drove north deep into the Highlands, Dominique felt the first genuine tremor of peace she had ever known. The landscape was a character unto itself, monumental, unapologetic, and fiercely independent. The mountains, the Munros, weren't polite Parisian hills. They were ancient, rugged giants draped in mist and shadow. The sky was immense, a towering dome of constantly shifting grey and cerulean. It was here, amidst this vast, untamed beauty, that she felt the immediate, electrifying sense of being perfectly aligned with the world. When she stepped out onto the vast, empty moorland overlooking Loch Ness, the world tilted back onto its correct axis. The cold wind ripped across the heather, and she inhaled deeply, recognizing the scent of the peat and the damp moss, not with fear, but with a sudden overwhelming comfort. This wasn't just scenery, it was the architecture of her soul. This profound, immediate sense of homecoming, the feeling that a specific landscape holds the key to your identity, is more common than we might admit. It's the whisper of ancestral memory, the geographical echo of a past self, or simply the biological imperative of the spirit finding its ideal resonance frequency. For Dominique, this was the definitive proof that her distress in Paris had not been madness, but a sane reaction to being in the wrong skin, in the wrong place. Every fiber of the landscape seemed to greet her, pulling the restless, agonizing energy right out of her bones. The vastness of the space reflected the vastness she always felt inside, but here it was not scary, it was sanctuary. The sheer, physical relief flooded her senses. She spent days simply walking the glens and climbing the lower peaks, letting the rhythm of the rugged terrain replace the frantic, false rhythm of the city. She visited the small, remote villages, finding a warmth and a groundedness in the people that contrasted starkly with the guarded formality of Parisian society. She didn't have to perform here, she could simply exist. This was the place from her visions. This was the place that tasted like home. She didn't just feel comfortable, she felt known. It was a sense of profound, instantaneous recognition, a shattering certainty that she had walked this ground countless times before. The man with the sea-storm eyes, the distant smoke, it was all here. The intellectual part of her mind, trained by Parisian logic, suggested genetics, memory, or perhaps a temporary mental break. But the deepest part of her soul simply whispered, "You are home. You have been waiting for this." The intensity of this feeling was overwhelming. It wasn't just a holiday fling with a romantic landscape. It was an identity crisis solved in a single breathtaking moment. She began obsessively sketching the local geography, finding the faces of strangers familiar, and tracing patterns on ancient stone walls, as if recalling a forgotten alphabet. The headaches, the crushing anxiety, and the disassociation that plagued her in France began to dissipate. She smiled for the first time in years, a genuine, unforced upturn of the lips. The trip ended, and the return to Paris was torture. The air felt thin, the chatter meaningless, and the apartment, once an emblem of success, now felt like a gilded cage. Within 2 weeks, she made a decision that caused a small earthquake in her family's social circle. She would move. The inevitable arguments were brutal. Her father threatened to cut her off, her mother wept dramatically over the shame she brought to the family name, and the psychiatrist was brought back in, suggesting institutional care. Dominique didn't fight. She simply stated her truth. She couldn't live there anymore. She sold a small portfolio of stocks that were legally hers, enough to buy a modest, sturdy 4x4 and rent a tiny cottage in a village outside of Aviemore, a place that felt perpetually on the edge of the true wilderness. The practical reality of her new life crashed down immediately. She was utterly unqualified for anything outside of managing a high-end art collection. Her French education, while elite, was useless for manual labor or customer service. She spent 3 miserable months living off her savings, applying for jobs she didn't want, and feeling the first pangs of real non-existential panic. She realized that exchanging her inheritance for freedom came with the cost of cold, hard work. Then one blustery afternoon, she walked into the Piper's Rest, a classic, cozy pub in a village so remote it barely registered on a GPS. The owner, a man named Angus with a beard like spun copper and a laugh that shook the glasses, watched her sit silently by the fire for an hour, sipping a half-pint of stout. He wasn't charmed by her beauty, he was intrigued by her quiet determination. When she finally approached him, asking in halting, accented English if she needed a cleaner, a server, or a dishwasher, he simply looked at her immaculate coat and asked, "What are you running from, lassie?" She answered truthfully, "Not running from, running to. I need to be here, and I need to work." He gave her a trial shift washing dishes, a job that quickly evolved into serving. She worked until her hands were raw and her feet ached, scrubbing sticky tables, pouring pints, and enduring the good-natured, sometimes blunt humor of the locals. It was the hardest, most grounding work she had ever done, and she loved every second of it. Her mind, busy with the simple, essential tasks of making change and remembering drink orders, finally quieted. The visions stopped. The awful, hollow feeling of displacement lifted. She laughed now easily at Angus's jokes and the banter of the regulars, her laughter feeling robust and real, no longer a brittle Parisian chime. Her world was reduced to the warmth of the fire, the clink of glasses, the smell of burnt wood, and the satisfying exhaustion at the end of a long day. And then there was Hamish. He was a local stonemason, a man whose hands were permanently dusted with granite dust, and whose eyes were the exact shade of grey-blue she had seen in her visions, the turbulent, shifting color of a deep sea storm. He was quiet, rugged, and possessed a stillness that she found infinitely more comforting than the frantic energy of her past acquaintances. He was a regular, sitting at the bar on Tuesdays and Fridays, nursing a whiskey and observing her with that intense, silent gaze. Their interactions were initially limited to the usual Hamish and a nod. But one night, after a sudden blizzard trapped the remaining patrons, they were forced to talk. They spoke of the landscape, the unforgiving beauty of the winter, and the ancient history that seemed to hang in the Highland air. He told her stories of the stones he worked with, how they recorded time, and she listened, utterly captivated by the simple, profound honesty of his life. The tension between them was not the high-strung, nervous flirtation she knew from Paris. It was elemental, like 2 tectonic plates slowly recognizing a fault line. One late afternoon, she was walking the moor near her cottage, wrapped in thick wool, her face stung by the rain, when she found him repairing a dry stone wall, his massive hands fitting the rocks together with patient precision. She sat on a nearby boulder, watching, mesmerizing by the quiet strength of his movements. He eventually stopped, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and walked over to her. "You look like you belong here now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I do," she whispered, her throat tight. He reached out, his hand warm and rough, and gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek, his touch sending a tremor that went deeper than skin. That first touch was a confirmation, a physical echo of the recognition her soul had felt the moment she stepped onto the moor. The kiss that followed was slow and deliberate, tasting of whiskey and cold air, yet containing a heat that instantly banished the chill. It was a kiss of homecoming. Their romance unfolded with the intensity and natural rhythm of the changing seasons. Hamish didn't seek to understand her Parisian past. He simply accepted her Highland present. Their physical intimacy was a revelation. With Hamish, the guarded coolness that had defined her existence melted away. His body was lean and hard from a life of labor, and his approach was patient, powerful, and deeply sensual. There was a moment early in their relationship, in the rough comfort of her small cottage, when he held her face in his stone-dusted hands, and she saw him not just as Hamish, the stonemason, but as the man from her vision, the man with the sea-storm eyes who belonged in that rough-hewn cottage. When he finally claimed her, there was an exchange of energy that felt ancient and necessary, a primal connection to the earth beneath them. His kisses were deep, exploring the hidden, starved places of her mouth, and the strong, rhythmic press of his body was a language more eloquent than any she had ever learned in Paris. She clung to him, reveling in the friction and the overwhelming feeling of being utterly anchored, no longer floating rootless. Their lovemaking was not about fleeting pleasure. It was about laying claim to a shared past, present, and future, the culmination of a journey that spanned continents and perhaps lifetimes. She would trace the calluses on his palms, feeling the history of his work, and he would marvel at the smooth yet now strong lines of her body, marked by the transformation she had undergone. She had exchanged the luxury of silk sheets for the warmth of wool blankets, and the smell of expensive perfume for the scent of wood smoke and Hamish's skin, a trade she would never regret. They married quietly, an intimate ceremony in a small ancient chapel overlooking the loch, with Angus and a few locals as witnesses. Dominique, the heiress who was destined for a dynasty, found her kingdom in a small damp cottage, and her crown in the steady, unconditional love of a man who built walls with his hands. She was no longer the crazy, hallucinating daughter. She was a beloved member of a small, fierce community. The agonizing feeling of being different evaporated, replaced by the profound, simple joy of being exactly where she was meant to be. The moorlands no longer appeared in sudden, frightening visions. They were simply outside her window, real, familiar, and welcoming, forever signaling her home. She looked out at the rolling hills, a perfect, quiet contentment settling over her. She had shed the gilded prison of her past for the untamed freedom of the Highlands. And in doing so, she had finally found herself. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe button. It truly means the world to us and helps us grow. And hey, while you're at it, let's aim for 50 likes on this video. Help us smash that goal.